Good morning everyone, and welcome to our thought for the day for Monday the 27th of July. Our reading today comes from Luke's Gospel. A dispute also arose among them, that is the disciples, as to which of them was considered to be the greatest. And Jesus said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who's at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. You are those who have stood by me in my trials, and I confer on you a kingdom, just as my Father conferred one on me, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." Who is the goat? Yes, have you, it does make me laugh every time I see that. Who is the goat? Because I do think of goats and sheep and other animals with cloven feet. But anyway, who is the goat? Who's the greatest of all time? Is it? It's always part of our kind of conversation. Is it Ali? Is it Pele? Is it David Beckham? Is it Picasso? Is it Rembrandt? Is it Tchaikovsky? Is it Beethoven? Who is the greatest of all time? We're fascinated by who the greatest of all time is. And the disciples in Jesus' day were no different, except what might be different, what I hope is different, is they were trying to work out which of them was the greatest out of his followers. I mean, 3 years following Jesus, listening to all those sermons and seeing like this extraordinary humility in action again and again and again. Seeing Jesus interact with the lowliest and the poorest and the most marginal people and kind of lifting them. And there they are, discussing who is the greatest amongst us. Yeah. Well, actually, it reminds me a little bit of the story of the 18th century revivalists, Wesley and Whitefield. And they first met at Oxford University, and Wesley was very much Whitefield's mentor. I think Whitefield was invited by John Wesley's brother, Charles Wesley, and they weren't particularly wealthy, the Wesleys, at all, but they had been to respectable boarding schools, whereas Whitefield was from the West Country. He had a West Country twang, which he kept all through his ministry, and he actually used to wait tables at the local inn, and the customers were his fellow students. So he was very much a sort of a poor man in a rich man's world, and he was very happy to be invited to the Wesley's Holy Club, which they had begun. And at the Holy Club, of course, they talked about Jesus Christ, about what it meant to be a disciple, and they lay the foundations really for Whitefield's career. If you haven't heard of George Whitefield before, he was the most extraordinary orator. And he said that on hearing the words said by him, "Oh, Mesopotamia," people would fall down and cry. He was an extraordinary preacher, and really, in many ways, eclipsed John Wesley in terms of his popularity, and I think also in terms of his boldness, his willingness to push the envelope. It was George Whitefield who was the first to leave the safety and the niceties of Anglican buildings and the respectability of Anglicanism to go and, yes, wait for it, to go and preach outdoors. He preached outdoors, first to coal miners around Bristol, and then to the poor of London. And his ministry then carried on all over the UK and also over in America, where he was part of the awakening there. So George Whitefield became a real giant of the evangelical revival, awakening in this country in the 18th century and overseas in the States. And him and John Wesley had quite a complicated relationship, where Wesley was kind of methodical. I suppose the father of Methodism should be methodical, and quite cold and kind of calculating and very structured. Whitefield was different in personality. He was hugely charismatic, he was a real showman, he was warm. They also began to have theological differences. And most of this centered on things like predestination and grace. And John Wesley was an Arminian, and George Whitefield, especially having spent quite a lot of time in America, became a Calvinist. Now, this is thought for the day, not lecture for the day, so I'm not going to go into the differences. You can look it up, the differences. You can look up the difference between Arminianism and Calvinism. Go and look it up on Google. But for them, these differences were actually secondary, but for their followers would often get really heated about it. And there was this constant debate about who the greatest of these revival preachers was. Who was the one who was really sent by God? Now, it's crazy, isn't it? As a result, a lot of their followers would actually argue with each other, get into really heated debates. But the great thing about these two men is, even though they did have their differences, without a doubt, actually they still loved each other because they both loved Jesus Christ. And they both knew that actually God lifts up who? The greatest of all time? No. He always lifts up the humble. He always lifts up the poor. He always lifts up the weak. Not the ones who think they've got it all made. And this morning's reading is just a reminder of that. Just to quickly finish, when Whitefield died, who preached at his funeral? Well, he'd instructed that John Wesley would. And of course, when John Wesley talked about his old friend George Whitefield, with whom he had all these differences that all his followers were so keen to underline, he just spoke, of course, so incredibly kindly and highly of him. These men were very different, and yet they were both able to remember that it is by serving that we lead, not the other way around. Have a great day, and see you again next time. Bye-bye.